Thank you for having me here today. Both inside and outside the humanities, scholars are nowadays increasingly convinced that the universal practice of art production and perception could be explained as emerging from shared cognitive systems. One assumption is that a preference for certain spatial proportions result from the way in which the visual cortex of the brain has adapted in response to certain stimuli from the environment, which in turn has provided humans with core knowledge of geometry, for example. And how and why should core knowledge not affect the higher level of culture in which geometry, as a repertoire of forms and as a set of design principles, appears to be universally applied? And such could then be tested by psychological and neuroscientific experiments, of which the data either confirms or rejects these claims. That is the idea. And I refer to data in this context as the quantifiable results of these experiments, in fact as the numbers that express a value of something which has been measured. So this is a reflection on both interdisciplinarity, what happens when the fields of humanities, the social sciences and the natural sciences start to use each other's methods, and also the consequences of that. In the 15th century already, architect Leon Battista Alberti explained linear perspective not just as a system with which to represent three-dimensionality on the picture plane, but also as a way to arrange the different parts of the picture plane. So a well-organized picture plane is a necessary precondition for the painting's clarity. So the compositio is necessary for the perspicuitas. He borrowed those terms from classical rhetoric. And it also would enhance the rhetorical effect of the painting, precisely because designing according to geometrical laws of linear perspective would be in accordance with the way the human mind has a natural sensitivity for such ordering, as the human mind follows the laws of nature. So linear perspective as a system is equally in accordance to these natural laws. And this rhetoric effect would then be visible clearly in Leonardo da Vinci's Last Supper, which we see here, where the vanishing point is just above the head of Christ. So the viewer's gaze is immediately guided to the central and most important figure of the image. Geometry as a set of principles at the disposal of the designer becomes a major concern for the British design reformists who, in the wake of the Great Exhibition of 1851, which we see the Crystal Palace here, were formulating new criteria for art education. And the aim was to improve the aesthetic quality of British products and British ornamentation. And according to the influential Owen Jones, abstraction was key. And to underscore his propositions, which he formulated in the Grammar of Ornament, he mainly drew on Islamic ornamentation, for a large part, of which he encountered the most perfect examples of the Alhambra in Spain. Jones was convinced that such perfect ornamentation is achieved only by designing according to geometrical principles in accordance with nature's laws. And therefore, such design would also appeal to the human mind naturally. So a belief which presupposes a self-evident interaction between the natural laws that dictate how things should be constructed and the natural laws that structure perception. German architect and architecture theorist Gottfried Semper developed a conception of the history of art and architecture, which could be regarded as analogous to theories of evolution and origin, which were emerging in the 50s of the 19th century, of which, of course, the most famous example is Darwin's Origin of Species. And Semper's main argument holds that architecture, as the central art form, had arisen from the hearth, since this was the first place where people gathered together in relative safety and started to cultivate and ritualize aspects of their lives, activities with which culture basically emerged. And out of the necessity for protection, the hearth became extended with the base, the roof and the encircling. From these four elements of architecture sprung the Urmotiv, For instance, the encircling of walls could be traced back to the earliest forms of protection, that of a tent, which relied on the practice, which in itself lies at the heart of textiles, so the weaving together of different strings of bark, for instance, or other natural fibers, and then to make a two-dimensional flat piece of cloth, which could function as a covering surface. Miri Vattem, in her book on Gottfried Semper and historicism, explained the Ur motif as the material manifestation of the ritual act of labor, which provided men with necessary means of protection in the form of this encircling. And this Ur motif is then in turn results in Ur formen, which would be translated later in other materials, and which would explain why motifs and patterns that presumably were derived from weaving, such as the motifs of the guilloche, were then applied as ornaments in stone architecture and on monumental sculpture as well. So this touches a little bit on the skeuomorphism in the talk of Louisa. And we have another example of that, which I encountered in the stairs of Saint Agnès Fourier de Moura, which literally see a woven mat in stone. For Semper, not just wall and floor ornamentation, but also the art of painting were all tributary to this Ur motif. In essence, they are all a form of what he called bekleiding. Towards the end of the 19th century, the beliefs about how the human mind would have been attuned to favor perfect ratios and symmetrical beauty became an interest for the emerging field of psychology. Rather than to philosophize about beauty, such as the philosophers of art had done for ages, psychologist Gustav Fechner was convinced that the presumed preference for the golden ratio could be empirically proved by means of experiment. Here we have it. Fechner asked, for instance, participants to rank a number of rectangles with different ratios from the least to the most beautiful. And the majority of the participants indeed seemed to rank the rectangle with the golden ratio as the most beautiful one. And those who did not appeared to favor a ratio which was close to that. Instead of this quest for universals, the field of art history during the second half of the 20th century became increasingly interested in the particular, which was expressed in the growing attention for non-Western art, outsider art, folk and decorative art, and other art that had remained unrepresented in the Western canon. As a result, art historians became also interested in new research methods from outside of the field of art history, such as the field of anthropology could, for instance, provide. Methods that potentially would be better in describing the conditions under which those art forms were produced and perceived, which were found outside the Western canon. Methods that would overcome art historical limitations and enable a diverse approach. Despite an increasing interdisciplinary perspective, most art historians were initially not necessarily aiming at unveiling universal principles. When ideals of equality were embraced in the 70s, some art historians felt the need to abandon the worn-out hierarchy through which the Western arts had set the norm for ages for once and for all. The main argument with which the canon was attacked usually revolved around downplaying the differences between cultures or emphasizing the hybridity of individual cultures. And inspired by postmodern philosophy, some declared cultures incommensurable and therefore only to be judged by their own merits. As opposed to emphasizing the particularities of different cultures, one could also, of course, emphasize the commonalities. And this approach seems for some reason to be favored by many researchers from psychology, biology, and neuroscience, who have themselves no art historical or humanities background. Again, the hypotheses on the universality of general aspects of the perception of art became the point of departure for many empirical experiments, to a certain extent recapturing the tradition which Fechner had started a century earlier. And these experiments generate quantifiable data, which provides the conclusions of these experiments with scientific legitimacy. Besides, nowadays there has emerged an increasing confidence in large amounts of data that will reveal what the people like, what they think, and eventually what they want. Neuroscientists like Semir Zeki and V.S. Ramachandran enthusiastically started to explain the history of art as the history of the response of our neurons to the visual stimuli in a constant changing environment. And this would both explain the individual artist's style peculiarities as well as universals. So the first would be the result of the individual artist's adaptation to his local environment and personal social conditions, while the second could be explained as invariables that have been selected for in the course of evolution, as a result of confrontation with and adaptation to ever-recurring perceptual phenomena. For instance, like the ability to recognize faces, it is crucial for survival and therefore imminent present at birth, although there is still debate about the extent to which its development relies on actual visual experience during the first crucial months of life, but it will nevertheless develop. Likely, humans possess other such capacities with an innate foundation. As an organism which for its survival depends on its ability to navigate through three-dimensional space, it makes sense to assume that the visual cortex has adapted to this situation and has become attuned, for instance, in order to quickly grasp certain geometrical relations and proportions. Much empirical work on innate geometrical knowledge has been executed by Dr. Elizabeth Spelke from Harvard University, who is interested in the least innate knowledge that preconditions more advanced cognition of the faculties of language, geometry, and reasoning. Years of cross-cultural experimentation has shown that preschool children are already sensitive to angle and direction, while at the same time they perform not so good in recognizing sense, such as recognizing the mirror image of a shape. This indicates that some knowledge about geometric properties would indeed develop prior to one's school years, while more complicated geometrical reasoning requires knowledge obtained by education. Such sensitivity to geometrical properties as angle and direction that was revealed in Spelke's psychological experiments could likely be explained as having a neural basis. French cognitive neuroscientist Stanislas Dehaene, who worked both on number and reading, assumes that language signs as well as arithmetic and mathematical symbols origin from an area in the brain sensitive to shape, an area which would have provided humans with a generic alphabet of shapes. One explanation of how such an alphabet emerged would be that constellations of contour line or crossings on borders of surfaces, or the crossing of branches of trees, which were frequently encountered in the natural habitats men dwelled in, would have been the catalyst for this kind of shape sensitivity and selectivity, and would have laid the foundations from which later systems of symbolic representation could draw. And I've tried to illustrate that by, this is a photo from somewhere in The Hague where I live, which is the place most nearest to wild environments I could find today. So the idea is then that these crossings of trees would have been somehow imprinted in the human mind in the course of time. It's a hypothesis, it's not my hypothesis, but just as an illustration, I try to show it this way. So the assumption that innate geometric knowledge as the result of many millennia of man's confrontation with the environment has partly constituted the nature of man's culturally developed symbolic systems, of course makes sense. Still, the important question is whether and how to bridge the gap between such core knowledge of geometry and the highly cultural and complex context of something like geometric ornament, when trying to find the proper arguments and evidence. The methodological problem with which Fechner was already faced in the 19th century holds that in order to gather data about human responses to visual stimuli and human preferences for certain geometric ratios, one has to reduce the object of study to measurable variables. In Fechner's experiment, that variable of the ratio applied to the simple rectangles had to explain the preference for the golden section, which historically has always been associated with the beauty of certain artworks. And therefore one can doubt its validity of these experiments. With respect to the actual judgments of taste, do we really find plain rectangles, whatever their ratio, is beautiful? In his critique on Fechner, Dutch mathematician van der Schoot argues that we judge a building, a painting, a statue, or an ornament as beautiful in its completeness, but not for the single fact that it is rectangular. We do this willingly, however, when the experimenter demands such a judgment from us. But what insights do such experiments yet provide about our true judgments? By reducing geometric ornament into a number of measurable variables, we might stumble into large problems because one is inevitably dragged into a kind of reduction which could leave one literally with nothing more than a single point. Alberti had precisely done that when he explained geometry for his Artist in Della Pittura, in which he went back to the most basic elements of geometry. And the basic element of geometry was the point, which only in succession in a determinate direction would form a line, such as we see here. At the level of such abstraction, we have completely lost sight of the object of inquiry, since basically anything somehow originated from a single point. Probably the whole universe did. Therefore, the main question with regards to the process of reduction is, and forgive me a geometrical metaphor here, is where to draw the line. As an art historian, I consider the simple reduction of the complexity of cultural artifacts into a number of properties which provoke certain responses that are quantifiable as data as largely unproductive. Certainly, intricate geometric patterns fascinate us almost naturally, whether or not they are loaded with content, and this seems to be a quality of geometric design that logically calls for an explanation on both a more psychological as well as a philosophical level. I agree with anthropologist Alfred Gell and art historian Oleg Graber, the late Gell and Graber, I must say, who both argued that geometric ornament has the ability to fascinate the viewer, not necessarily because of innate preferences for geometric proportions, but precisely because of its ability to adopt and carry inconclusive significance and as such function as an intermediary. It is surprising to note how much significance people apparently still want to see in geometrical patterns, especially in cases in which content is not predominantly given. I have gone back, but nothing terribly happened. So. There is a disputed hypothesis by art historian Raphael Payer of how the geometric floor designs of Venice, St. Mark's Cathedral, relates to the figurative mosaics of the cupolas and thereby, as it were, adopts the content of these mosaics. Personally, I think the central part of the floor of Santa Maria del Ammiraglio in Palermo supports this hypothesis much clearer. My images have somehow got reversed. This is the floor. The square floor part consists of a central porphyry roundel with 4 smaller roundels at the 4 cardinal points. This part is bordered by a band which contains 8 roundels interspersed with 8 figurative elements in the form of vases from which 2 birds appear to drink. Well, I've read in the literature that it is interpreted as birds. The central roundel appears to correspond to the central figure of Christ in the cupola. Like the 4 corner roundels emerging from the central one appear to correspond to the 4 archangels surrounding Christ. The 8 vases correspond to the palm trees in the tambour of the cupola. Above those trees in the cupola, one finds 8 prophets. The 4 corner roundels at the edges of the central part of the floor, so I mean, the roundels in between the corners appear to correspond to the 4 larger windows of the cupola, and the 4 smaller windows extend from the niches containing the evangelists. I've lost one sentence here, but the idea is that all the geometric roundels and patterns you see on the floor correspond to the images of the cupola, which is precisely at the top of it. So in this way, the theologian content of the figurative mosaic of the cupola is transferred to the geometric layout of the central floor, which becomes a carrier of significant meaning. The floor finds itself between the entrance of the church and the main altar, and it is known from similar geometric floors like the Cosmati floors, whether or not explicitly linked to figurative elements, that its porphyry roundels and rectangles were places with liturgical significance, where processions stopped and where prayers were held. So in the Santa Maria del Amiralio, such a significance of the geometric layout in correspondence to the figurative cupola would have been clear for the contemporary public. The modern viewer today would presumably just admire these floors for their beauty and craftsmanship. Core knowledge of geometry only explains on a very basic level the preconditions which enables humans to construct and perceive geometric shapes and designs in the first place. Experiments may quantify the kind of different judgments aimed at geometric ornament. It may even find an average most favored one. It may further reveal certain regularities considering the geometric constellations of the geometric ornament itself. Still, these empirical methods alone cannot reveal the complex processes through which humans impute geometric ornaments the power to establish a meaningful force of attraction between the subject and the ornamented object. The overarching problem of the whole empirical procedure when applied to the arts concerns the fact that it is no longer clear how the data relates to the complex cultural context from which we have extracted the object of research. One could therefore even wonder whether data is still data in the true sense, as something given. Although data is supposed to capture phenomena, it is probably not even capta, though in fact facta. It denotes fact, not as containing certain truth, but in the sense of that which is the final outcome of a process of making, causing, doing, and performing of an act. You could regard an experiment as an act. And as such, it has become factum. And in that capacity, it might even be more self-referential. One then wonders how much content it still denotes of that which it is supposed to capture. Thank you. Oh, my last slide is the discussion.